Think about the last time you completely rearranged yourself for someone. Not just compromised, rearranged. Maybe it was a partner. Maybe it was a parent, a best friend, a boss, even a group chat you didn't want to get kicked out of. You used to have opinions, preferences, a way of laughing that was unmistakably yours. And then slowly, so slowly you didn't even clock it happening, your reactions started arriving a half second after you checked someone else's face first. You told yourself you were just being easygoing, flexible, low maintenance, the kind of person anyone would be lucky to have around. But somewhere underneath that easy, agreeable smile, a quieter question was living rent-free in your chest. Who am I when nobody's watching me try to be accepted?
Here's the assumption most of us walk around with, the one that feels so obvious we never bother questioning it. We assume that belonging requires sacrifice, and sacrifice is good. So the more we give up of ourselves, the more love, approval, or security we deserve in return. Lose enough of yourself, the logic goes, and you become irreplaceable, easy to keep around, impossible to reject. It sounds almost noble when you say it like that. Selflessness as loyalty. But here's the psychological twist nobody warns you about. The people who disappear the most into their relationships, of any kind, are very often the ones who end up feeling the least known. Not because the people around them are cool, sometimes because nobody can truly connect with a person who isn't fully there to be connected with. You can't hold on to smoke. And that's what happens to a self that's been slowly, quietly erased. It becomes smoke. Present in the room, impossible to grasp.
Hi, I'm Leo, and welcome to my channel. Today I want to take you somewhere a little uncomfortable, but I promise it's worth the trip. Because by the end of this, you're going to understand exactly why you or someone you love learned to vanish in order to be kept.
Let's start with a story, because this always starts with a story, even when we don't notice we're living inside one. Picture a kid, maybe 7 or 8 years old, sitting at a dinner table where the emotional temperature changes without warning. One night, a parent is laughing, loose, generous with affection. Another night, the air is thick before anyone's even said a word, and the kid learns to read barometric pressure off a parent's jaw muscles before they're old enough to read a chapter book. This child does what children do brilliantly, terrifyingly well. They adapt. They become a thermostat instead of a person. They start scanning rooms instead of living in them. If laughing too loud risks something, they get quiet. If having needs seems to cost too much, they stop voicing them. And crucially, the praise rolls in for this. Good kid, easy kid, never any trouble. What nobody says out loud is that the price of no trouble was a slow, voluntary disappearing act performed nightly for an audience that didn't know it was watching a performance at all.
This is where attachment theory walks onto the stage. And I promise I'll keep this from sounding like a lecture, because honestly, it isn't one. It's closer to a map of a country you've already been living in your whole life, in every relationship you've ever had, not just romantic ones. Psychologists talk about something called anxious attachment, which develops in environments where acceptance felt conditional, inconsistent, or tangled up with performance. If you grew up in a home, a friend group, or even a workplace where approval had to be earned through good behavior, achievement, or emotional caretaking of the people around you, your nervous system quietly drew a conclusion that's been running in the background ever since. My authentic self is risky. My adapted self is safe. And once a brain decides that, it doesn't forget. It just keeps applying the lesson across every context, friendships, family, careers, like a software update nobody asked for that somehow never stops installing. Here's where it gets genuinely fascinating, because losing yourself to be accepted isn't actually about the other person nearly as much as we think it is. It's about safety. Your brain isn't asking, how do I make this person happy? Underneath, in the older, more reptilian rooms of your mind, it's asking, how do I make sure I am not abandoned? And abandonment to a nervous system doesn't read as a social inconvenience. It reads as a threat to survival. This isn't poetry, by the way. This is wired into us. Human infants are born more helpless than almost any other mammal, completely dependent on caregivers for literal survival. So when attachment gets shaky in childhood, the brain doesn't file it under minor disappointment. It files it under 5-alarm fire. And that fire alarm, once installed, doesn't quietly retire when you turn 18. It just finds new buildings to go off in. A friend seeming a little distant, a colleague not responding fast enough, a family member's tone shifting slightly. Suddenly you're recalibrating your entire personality because some ancient part of your brain genuinely believes your survival depends on it.
Think about chameleons for a second, because I think they get a bad reputation in this metaphor. We use chameleon as an insult, like changing colors is some kind of moral failing, weakness dressed up as adaptability. But a chameleon doesn't change color because it's spineless. It changes color because somewhere evolution taught its body that visibility equals danger. That's not deception. That's survival wisdom running on autopilot. And the people who lose themselves to be loved, liked, or kept close are doing something remarkably similar. Their personalities have become camouflage, not because they're shallow or fake, but because some version of them, at some point, learned that being fully seen wasn't safe. The tragedy isn't that they're chameleons. The tragedy is that somewhere along the way, the forest itself taught them they needed to be. Now let's talk about what actually happens once this pattern takes the wheel, because it doesn't usually look dramatic from the outside. It looks like devotion, or loyalty, or being such a good friend. It looks like the person who always says, "I don't mind, whatever you want," until whatever you want has quietly swallowed an entire decade of choices, big and small. What to do on weekends, which career path to take, which opinions get voiced out loud in a meeting, which jokes get laughed at, even when they're not funny. Researchers studying something called self-concept clarity, basically how clearly and consistently a person understands who they are, have found that lower self-concept clarity is linked repeatedly to anxious attachment patterns and to lower satisfaction across relationships of all kinds, not just romantic ones. In plain English, the less clear you are on who you are, the more every relationship in your life starts running on fumes, because you're essentially asking other people to define you, and no human being, however caring, was built to carry that weight without eventually buckling under it.
And here's the cruel irony, the one that I think deserves a long, slow exhale before we keep going. The more a person disappears to keep love or belonging, the less the people around them can actually know them, because connection requires a target. It requires specificity. You can't build closeness with an echo. You can't form real intimacy, whether it's friendship, family bond, or romance, with someone whose every preference is just a mirror reflecting your own face back at you. Real connection needs friction, needs difference, needs two distinct people occasionally disagreeing about something as small as where to eat or as large as what matters in life. When one person dissolves entirely into the wants of the other, the relationship doesn't deepen, it flattens. It becomes a monologue performed by two voices, and eventually, often without either person fully understanding why, it starts to feel hollow. People frequently describe this exact dynamic with a confusing kind of guilt. They give me everything I want, and somehow I feel lonelier than ever around them. That loneliness isn't an accident. It's the predictable result of being close to someone who's gone quietly missing from their own life.
I want to bring in a concept here that I think explains so much of this, something psychologists call the false self, a term you'll hear in different forms across decades of clinical literature, most famously associated with the work of psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott. Winnicott proposed that when a child's authentic emotional expressions aren't met with attunement, when crying isn't soothed, when excitement isn't shared, when anger isn't tolerated, the child develops a kind of protective shell, a false self that exists to manage other people's reactions, while the real, spontaneous, messy, true self gets tucked away somewhere safer, somewhere it won't be punished or ignored.
The false self gets very, very good at its job. It's polite, it's accommodating, it reads rooms like a psychic. But it's also fundamentally exhausting to maintain because it's a performance with no intermission. And performances, however skilled, eventually run the performer ragged, whether the audience is a partner, a parent, or an entire office. I want to bring in a concept here that I think explains so much of this, something psychologists call the false self, a term you'll hear in different forms across decades of clinical literature, most famously associated with the work of psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott. Winnicott proposed that when a child's authentic emotional expressions aren't met with attunement, when crying isn't soothed, when excitement isn't shared, when anger isn't tolerated, the child develops a kind of protective shell, a false self that exists to manage other people's reactions, while the real, spontaneous, messy, true self gets tucked away somewhere safer, somewhere it won't be punished or ignored. The false self gets very, very good at its job. It's polite, it's accommodating, it reads rooms like a psychic. But it's also fundamentally exhausting to maintain because it's a performance with no intermission. And performances, however skilled, eventually run the performer ragged, whether the audience is a partner, a parent, or an entire office.
So why does this feel so much like love or loyalty if it's actually fear wearing a familiar costume? Because the body genuinely can't always tell the difference between anxious vigilance and deep affection. They produce remarkably similar physiological sensations. The racing heart when someone doesn't respond. The stomach drop when someone's tone shifts slightly. We've been culturally trained through centuries of stories to romanticize this exact sensation, not only in romance, but in friendship and family loyalty too. We call it devotion. We call it being a good person. Rarely do we call it what a psychologist might actually call it, which is a nervous system in a constant, low-grade state of alarm, mistaking adrenaline for closeness.
But here's where I want to gently turn this whole conversation. Because I don't think the point of understanding this pattern is to feel ashamed of it. I think the point is to feel less alone in it, and then, slowly, to feel curious about it instead of guilty. If you recognize yourself in any of this, the disappearing, the scanning, the performing, in any relationship with anyone, that's not evidence that you're broken or hopeless or destined to keep losing yourself forever. It's evidence that you were once a small person trying to survive in an environment that required you to. Adaptation is not a character flaw. It's a testament to how resourceful you were, how attuned, how perceptive, even as a child. The very sensitivity that made you good at disappearing is the same sensitivity that, redirected, makes you deeply empathetic, intuitive, and capable of real, profound connection. The skill was never the problem. The target was.
So what does coming back to yourself actually look like, practically, without turning this into a checklist? It often starts embarrassingly small. It's noticing, mid-conversation, that you're about to agree with something purely to avoid tension, and pausing just long enough to ask yourself what you'd say if nobody in the room could be disappointed in you. It's letting a silence sit after someone asks your opinion, instead of rushing to mirror theirs. Therapists who work with attachment patterns often talk about tolerating the discomfort of being seen. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Rebuilding a self means risking that the real you, the unfiltered, occasionally disagreeable, fully formed you, might not be liked by everyone, in any relationship, romantic or otherwise. That risk feels enormous to a nervous system that equates disapproval with danger. But it's also the only road back to connection that's actually sustainable. Because a relationship built on your disappearance can only ever hold the shape of your disappearance. It cannot hold you.
And maybe this is the quietly radical idea hiding underneath this entire topic. The goal was never to become more lovable, more likable, or more needed by becoming smaller. The goal, if there even is one tidy goal, is to become so genuinely, specifically yourself that the connection you receive, whether from a friend, a family member, a partner, or a colleague, is actually aimed at you, not at the version of you assembled out of someone else's preferences. That's a different kind of safety than the one your childhood nervous system was chasing. It's slower to build. It doesn't come with the immediate relief of being agreeable, but it's real in a way that performance never quite manages to be. And somewhere underneath all that careful adapting, I think you already know the difference.
If any part of this felt a little too familiar, a little too close to home, I'd genuinely love to hear about it in the comments. Not because I need the engagement, though I won't pretend that doesn't help the channel, but because these patterns lose so much of their power the moment we say them out loud to someone who understands. And if you want to keep untangling this stuff with me, stick around, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Until then, take up a little more space than you think you're allowed to. I promise it's safer than it feels.